Do you see the European Union too optimistic in their new action plan to make the EU climate neutral until 2050? And what are the challenges and possibilities?
Well, by way of background, let me point out that humanity's ever more excessive use and destruction of the planet and its resources has begun to interfere with the Earth's fundamental life support systems, from the atmosphere, climate, to the hydrosphere, oceans, to the lithosphere, land, and to the cryosphere, ice. With these systems destabilized, the pleasant 11,500-year epoch, known as the Holocene, is coming to an end, and with it the conditions that allowed life and human civilization to flourish. We are moving into an uncharted territory of a new human-made geological epoch named after the Faustian creator, the epoch of Anthropos, the human. To your question, of course, climate neutrality is the most important objective, but I fear that the seriousness of the situation, the climate emergency, is not fully appreciated. Put differently, the agreement reached last Wednesday between the European Parliament and the Council, the European Council, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% is not adequate to the challenge. For that, at least 65% would have been needed. And in the science, one doesn't say predictions with a categoric certainty. So if I say 65% would have guaranteed 1.5 degree target, yes, but only with a 2/3 chance. Continent to industrialize. And industrialization is a very carbon intensive, very energy intensive undertaking. Since carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for centuries, it matters that developed countries as a group have contributed 3/4 to the stock of carbon dioxide. Developing countries only 1/4. So very precise, the United States about 29%, EU about 27%, Russia 8%, China 8%, Japan 4%, India 2%, and all of Africa 2%. So it's a matter of fairness for Europe to contribute more than would be expected if we were only looking at current emissions. We have to consider the historical emissions. So it is one thing to pass or have an agreement that we will be climate neutral by 2050, but of course the big challenge is, what are we doing now? What the temperature will be in 2050 is determined by what we do now and in the next few years. Of course, from a global perspective, the European climate law is much better than those of others, the United States or China, not to mention Russia. But it still falls short considering what actually needs to be done to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Having lost decades, and since we are in the middle of an accelerating climate emergency, low ambitions today delay the needed mitigation and simply push the problem into the future, where solutions will be costlier and more difficult. So it is one thing to agree on a long-term plan, 55% reduction by 2050, but what is important, I think, is to map forward what will happen between now and then, to establish benchmarks, success criteria, timelines, so that, for example, in 2023 or 25 or 28, we can see if the plan is on target, if it moves as envisaged, or if and when and where course corrections are necessary, urgent, and inevitable. So there are many loose ends. I'll give you one short example. The European gas lobby is pushing to have gas declared as a sustainable energy resource, because they say it's a bridge technology, it's much better than coal, which is true. But it is not a sustainable energy resource, and the decision now has been deferred to the autumn, which gives the lobby, of course, another few months to make its case. Billions of euros are at stake for power stations, pipelines that will become worth more or less, depending on the decision and on the postponement yet again of climate neutrality. In short, being climate neutral by 2050 is too late. It is far too late, because there is a real danger once heating goes beyond 1.5 degrees, that tipping points will be crossed and that we will lose control over the climate.
Thank you very much for your answer. It brings up many concerns. How do you see the willingness of EU citizens to adapt their way of life to achieve this goal of the EU action plan? What is the role especially of the youth, considering it as a generation that will pass on the future? Especially, for an example, Fridays for Future movement.
Well, I see a lot of willingness among European citizens to contribute to climate neutrality. However, I think it is a treacherous misconception to frame the issue as one of individual behavior. You and I, as individuals, cannot generate peace in the Middle East. That is a policy challenge. So, as I mentioned before, the accelerating climate catastrophe is the greatest public policy challenge humanity has ever faced. It must be solved politically, and it must be solved globally. So governments must establish the goals, the rules, and the guardrails. Individuals play an important part, but I think more as citizens, as voters, as activists, than as consumers. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In the current COVID pandemic, citizens are expected to act responsibly, wear masks, socially distance, avoid meetings indoors, etc. But it is governments that set the rules, that incentivize the development of vaccines, and that organize inoculation campaigns. Similarly with global heating, citizens as consumers can contribute through their changed lifestyles, diets, mobility behavior, living arrangement, purchases, but governments set the rules on the price of carbon, on the level of subsidies, on the importation of commodities or trade agreements, decisions that are infinitely more weighty and significant than what individuals do or don't do. I think Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement she inspired changed the world for the better. Her short statement at the 2018 COP24 meeting in Katowice mobilized hundreds of millions of young people across the world. Climate change now features prominently in all election manifestos in the Western world. The Biden Climate Summit would not have happened without her, nor, in my country, Germany, the emergence of the Greens as a party with good chances to win the federal elections in September. So in the face of the evidence and the scientific consensus, of course, the categorical climate change deniers have gone quiet. Today, the problem are no longer the deniers. Today, the problems are the yes, but people, the greenwashers, the delayers, and the half-measure people. With renewable energy becoming ever more competitive, with crisis symptoms mounting, and with the green movements gaining ever more support, we are moving into an interesting phase of international politics and of national political discourses. The battle is certainly not won, but the signs are better than could have been expected a few years ago. For that, I think the youth movement, Fridays for Future and others, can take or has to be given credit.
Thank you very much for your answer. Let me ask you, if the majority of the people understand the gravity of the climate change, if not, how could the EU raise the awareness, especially considering Corona and the virus in Europe and the measures that the government take, as you mentioned? But since this, we still have a group of people who still debate if the virus is real, if you have to wear a mask, and so on and so on. I suppose that there is also a group of people who would not so much keep up with the measures if there would be any measures for climate neutral Europe. But what do you think about it?
Well, on the one hand, I see that polls across Europe show that a significant proportion of citizens are well aware of the climate crisis. There is considerable skepticism remaining, but a majority has understood that the science has solved the issue. I would think that this is firstly a challenge for political leaders, just like with the COVID pandemic. Crises are not popularity contests. They are leadership challenges. Nature, in both cases, does not negotiate nor consider political obstacles. Nature follows its own logic and imposes its own priorities. I think that awareness is best raised through coherent policies, calmly explained. What is it that must be achieved? In the climate sphere, I think what needs to be achieved categorically is to ensure that global warming does not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. All policies going forward, taxes, subsidies, investment, employment, technology, agriculture, must meet the 1.5 degree challenge. And that hard stop has to become the gravity center of the political discourse. I mean, I could tell you more about the parallels with COVID and climate, because I think there are, but let me stop answering this question right now and maybe we'll get back to that later.
Yes. The one I especially want to ask you, that all EU member states are legally bound to the European Green Deal through the European climate law. How can the EU react to a potential failure of a member state to meet the expectations of the plan? Do you see a possibility of using sanctions effectively in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a scientist, my preference is that the seriousness of the situation is widely understood and that some countries will take the lead in devising mitigation and adaptation measures. Establishing incentives towards ambition and rewarding ambition seems to me more promising than going after laggards or wasting energy on sanctions. As one sees with effective COVID vaccination campaigns, pushing forward and showing what can be done, as the United States, the United Kingdom, but also Israel are now demonstrating, is more successful in my view than fighting rearguard battles. President Biden's climate summit last week has shown how strong leadership can change the world's collective disposition, that it can generate momentum, open up solutions, and make even the most difficult challenges seem manageable. I do hope that the European Union will catch the US bug.
Thank you very much. So let me ask you something about the climate summit which happened last week in Washington. How can you interpret the results of this summit? What do you think? Will it change something? Will it maybe also, how can I say, connect the EU with the US in terms of cooperation to reach this neutral climate until, let's say, 2050?
Well, I do think that there are three crucial players to solve climate change, and that is the US, that is China, and that is the European Union. The others, frankly, do not much matter. If the three were to push coherently in one direction of decarbonization, of ending subsidies, of moving very quickly, that would be a game changer. Other countries would have to follow suit, and that's why, indeed, Europe is a very crucial player. Now, I'm very positive and I'm very optimistic about the climate summit last week. But sometimes, of course, I also think that I'm hoping too much, because the real, as I mentioned before, test is not saying what is a commitment to 2035 or 2050, or as China has said, 2060. It is what is happening now. So the first test is what will happen in Glasgow. The first test will also be if Europe now moves to cut its subsidies on fossil fuels, on making renewables competitive, on investing in renewable energy. What is on the table is much better than could have been expected, but it is still far from enough. Let me also be a bit critical of President Biden and his policies. In Paris, it was agreed that the Green Climate Fund that would help countries in the global south to decarbonize, not to go through the same phase that we have gone through with coal and steel, would be $100 billion a year. That is the money, this is not reparations, but this is simply investing, because carbon dioxide knows no borders. What is burned in Africa is changing the climate globally or in Europe. So therefore, the $100 billion is to electrify, for example, Africa, goal 7 of the Agenda 2030, by having renewables be competitive in Africa. Biden's contribution to the Green Climate Fund is still much less than what Obama promised, and European too, and we are not anywhere near the $100 billion. So the plans of Australia are terribly deficient, also of Japan, not to mention Russia. So as I mentioned, I think the climate has to become the gravity center of politics in everything we do, also vis-a-vis other countries. And so we might be on a good track, but we are in a marathon and have gone the first kilometer, and so 20 odd are still to be run, and whether we keep up the energy and the focus and the speed will be shown as we go forward.
Mr. Baumann, thank you very much for this really interesting interview. I hope that you will stay healthy and good in New York, and that as soon as it will be possible, that we will all gonna meet again in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Interesting questions, thank you. And I'm looking forward to hearing what the other participants in this program have to say. Thank you very much and good day.